All right, we have our lecture on chapter 10, which is the development of cardiorespiratory endurance. I think a great place to start with this is the definition of cardiorespiratory endurance. So if you pull the term apart, cardio is referring to heart, respiratory is referring to our respiratory system or our lungs, and endurance is just kind of looking at how long these two things can work together when we're exercising, right? So the definition that the book provides is cardiorespiratory endurance is a person's ability to sustain vigorous activity. So this could be in short, intense bursts, such as sprinting, right? Or they could be in prolonged or submaximal efforts, such as running a mile or a marathon. Or you can have a combination of both, right? Which might be an example like basketball, where, or soccer maybe, right? Maybe soccer's a little bit more on the end of the prolonged or submax, but you are running a lot, right? In both, which requires some form of prolonged endurance. And then you also have these short, intense bursts of energy, especially in basketball, like if you're performing a jump or something, right? So cardiorespiratory endurance, it doesn't just stay within the realms of certain types of exercise or certain types of activities, but definitely can span amongst a lot of different combinations. Its importance, right? It drives most of the physical activities that we participate in. So it's probably the number one importance of cardiorespiratory endurance, but also it promotes health and efficiency of the cardiac, right, muscle tissue, our vascular system, which is our blood supply, as well as our respiratory system, which is our lungs, or contains our lungs, right? So all of these systems are need to be in good function in order for us to have cardiorespiratory endurance, but they can't be in good function if we don't stress the systems appropriately with exercise. The greatest implications for lifelong health in comparison to other fitness components. Okay, so cardiorespiratory endurance has kind of the best associations with good health throughout the lifespan compared to like power or strength training. We want to talk about cardiorespiratory endurance in terms of both short and prolonged exercise. We're going to start with short-term exercise first, and we're going to look at what the different physiological responses are to short-term exercise. Whenever we're doing short-term exercise, we're primarily relying on our anaerobic systems or processes, right? And these are going to be usually duration-wise about 10 seconds or less. Basically, this means that we would be depleting local stores of oxygen and blood glucose, as well as our glycogen stores and our phosphocreatine system. Again, a lot of this is exercise physiology based, but you can see motor development has found its way in there. I have a small figure on the side that kind of shows the process of glycolysis, which is all that happens in the anaerobic system, where we've got some molecule of glucose or we have glycogen that's stored in the liver or skeletal muscle that's been converted to glucose. Glycolysis is just the process of breaking down that glucose and producing energy from it. So we have this huge process where we can actually also produce lactic acid or lactate. Both terms are used interchangeably, at least in the research that I've read. They don't, other than a hydrogen component, they don't really have that much of a difference. So we know that usually when we do short-term exercises or if we're doing small bursts of a lot of power, a lot of times our muscles will get fatigued and sore really quickly, and that's due to that buildup of that lactic acid. But we also produce lactate in other forms of exercise that are longer duration, so it's just a byproduct that we usually associate with fatigue. But generally, this glycolysis or this glycolytic process is really, really short, yields a very small amount of energy, but is a really, really quick production of energy, which is good for these short duration types of exercises. Performance measurements for short-term exercise are usually anaerobic power or anaerobic capacity. Anaerobic power is more kind of geared towards our peak or mean power during exercise bouts of 10 seconds or less. So you can think about this as like a squat, 1 RM. Anaerobic capacity usually is referring to the maximum oxygen deficiency a person can tolerate. Because anaerobic, aerobic means oxygen utilizing. An kind of means without oxygen. So short-term exercises usually don't rely a whole lot on free-flowing oxygen. But we look at capacity in terms of looking at this curve here, which you've probably seen if you've taken 301 with Dr. Cotter before. We've got oxygen consumption in liters per minute on the bottom. And then we have our ventilatory capacity, or our minute ventilation, which is represented by VE on the side, or on our y-axis. So basically this is just telling us, and we've also got another component over here, which I'm pretty sure is looking at lactate, but again, we're not primarily concerned with that right now. But our minute ventilation is represented by this red line or set of dots, and then blood lactate is set by this yellow line. And what we can see is that there's kind of this point, or this threshold, or ventilatory threshold rather, that kind of splits up our anaerobic capacity from our aerobic capacity, or notes the major shift in physiological processes between these, short duration or longer duration exercise. Kind of a fun thing is that we usually can tell where a person's anaerobic capacity is at their ventilatory threshold as well as their lactate threshold. Exercise physiology is not my strong suit, but I do know that these two things happen at the same time typically, and that's where our accumulation of lactate kind of tells us when we're starting to rely on these anaerobic processes or these glycolytic processes without going into the whole oxidative electron transport chain, all that stuff, right? If we're just relying on this little process to give us our 2 ATP or what have you, we're going to be producing a lot more lactate. So the increased amounts of lactate in anaerobic types of exercise will be higher, right, than we would expect them to be in aerobic exercise, where we're utilizing the full cycle of the electron transport chain, which is not shown in this picture. Our ventilatory threshold is also measured by how much oxygen we are utilizing, or our minute ventilation, which is how many liters of oxygen per minute we're utilizing for our blood generally. So when our uptake starts to increase, or we need to have more, usually minute ventilation is in breaths per minute, right? If we need more breaths per minute, that means we need more oxygen coming in, because we need that to start being utilized for other aerobic processes, or what we've got going at a muscular level is not enough to sustain if we go past kind of this 10-second duration. So usually we notice this shift to aerobic systems from our anaerobic processes as exercise demands lengthen. So usually around 90 seconds, you start to shift to aerobic, or primarily aerobic energy, which is oxidative processes, but you still have some anaerobic stuff going on. So typically at 90 seconds, we say that these are about equal to each other, although I'm a little bit more biased to say that aerobic energy is the primary contributor to exercise at about 90 seconds. Once you get to about 3 minutes of exercise, though, you are mostly guaranteed to have solely energy coming from aerobic processes. So yeah, we're just kind of highlighting this shift that happens. Anaerobic power and capacity are going to be reliant more on glycolytic processes, less oxygen, or we don't need a lot of oxygen for those things to happen. But as time passes or the exercise duration lengthens, we need to utilize more oxygen, thus the shift to aerobic processes or metabolic processes. Anaerobic performance is related to body size. So the amount of fat-free and muscle mass that you have, right? The more muscle mass somebody has, probably the better their anaerobic capacity is going to be, because they've got more muscle to kind of carry out those different anaerobic processes. We also have the ability to metabolize substrates as fuel at the muscular level. So again, more muscle fibers that are available to kind of metabolize any available glucose, or if the more muscle tissue we have, the more glycogen we can store. So the more glycogen we have, the more we can convert to glucose, thus the more we can utilize that glucose. So it kind of all goes together. Anaerobic performance is also related to quick mobilization of oxygen delivery systems. So there are different shuttles in our body that kind of mobilize oxygen to different areas of the body, but if we are able to kind of mobilize those oxygen delivery systems, those are also related to anaerobic performance, which kind of seems a little bit counterintuitive, because we're like, oh, anaerobic performance does not rely on oxygen. It doesn't solely rely on oxygen. Oxygen is kind of just like the local, whatever the local store of oxygen is within a given area, because blood, we know, has oxygen. Any cellular processes are reliant on oxygen, so oxygen is available, but it's more of a local anaerobic, or local oxygen stores are being used in anaerobic performance. But this quick mobilization of oxygen delivery to the right tissues when we're performing these short burst activities is really important to overall anaerobic performance. Children have lower overall anaerobic power than adults do. Kind of makes sense because of these two things. One, they have a lower total available energy because they have a lower total muscle mass, right? We know that muscle mass doesn't start to build until the adolescent period, and power output is going to increase gradually with age through the adolescent period. So total work output increases with age. That can be seen with this graph here. And you'll notice boys have the blue line, girls have this purple line. We can see that age is on our x-axis, and our 10-second work output, or our anaerobic performance, is on our y-axis. So typical typical developmental trajectory type graph. And we can see that both genders pretty much increase up until this adolescent period, which is around 14. Typically, girls or females are going to have a plateau in power output around age 15 or 16, which we can see by this flattened curve. Males are going to have a prolonged period of gradual increase in their power output, and that's because their adolescent period is longer. Also, we know that testosterone changes play a role in protein synthesis and building more muscle mass. The more muscle mass you have, the more anaerobic power you have as well. So this is not set in stone though. So some women, maybe where we see this plateau effect, that can be counteracted with training, which we can see in this graph here. Now the y-axis is a little bit different. Some of you might be looking at the numbers and you're like, whoa, if we go back to this one, their power output was at 2,000, all the way up to about 4,000 when they plateaued. Why the low numbers? Well, this y-axis is in joules per kilogram, so it's their power output relative to their body weight. And we can see research at least has shown that anaerobic power can increase with training. So the plateau effect that we see at 14 or 16 still has potential to increase if we implement a training program. So it's not over, okay? Also, your scores can still, or your power output scores or power output in total can still increase based on diet and exercise. So if someone's engaging in hypertrophy training, consuming large amounts of protein to kind of counteract any, what's the word I'm looking for? It's the breakdown of protein, proteolysis maybe. Yeah, I don't know. But when you exercise, you have micro tears in your muscle fibers, and protein will be kind of recycled, and then you need more dietary protein to make sure that you're rebuilding that muscle that was lost, and then kind of building even more as you get your strength gains. So diet and exercise can have a role, but generally research has shown that children and adolescents have a higher peak and mean power after training compared to untrained counterparts. So extrinsic factors primarily affecting anaerobic performance are training and diet and exercise. It all comes back to the same things, you guys. I keep repeating myself. If we look at anaerobic development and training in adulthood, so this post-adolescence, usually anaerobic performance is pretty stable. Gains, or any observable gains at least, in anaerobic power capacity are results of training alone. So when we're in the adolescent period, we have, the hormones kind of playing a factor. Those are more intrinsic factors, right? We have hormones playing a role. You might have other intrinsic factors like genetics that have predetermined what type of muscle fiber types you're going to have. And that in turn kind of tells you, what type of activities you'll be good at. So the more type 2 fibers you have, the better anaerobic power and capacity you'll have. But, there's a lot of different roles that or a lot of different factors that could be playing a role in anaerobic development in our adolescent period. But kind of once you've hit your peak adulthood, there's not really much changes unless you're consistently training. So that's kind of shown with this graph representation over here, where age is on the x-axis again. We see growth and development kind of maximize our muscle mass and strength, because mass is pretty proportional to strength. But early in life, we notice, there's like a really large increase to that peak, and then we can maintain that peak through our adult life. This top line is supposed to represent people who train versus the bottom line, which is people who don't train. So if you're not training, you're generally just going to have this gradual decrease. That natural decline is about 6 to 8% per decade from age 35 to 70. And then older in life, we already know, or at least we've talked about kind of reduced activity once we get to older adulthood, and that's going to lead to less movement, which leads to atrophy, right? So less muscle mass available to produce the anaerobic power that we may have measured earlier in life. These declines could be age-related. So, like I said, if we're not moving with age, obviously, right? They could be due to changes in muscle mass or fiber type as a result of aging. So if you I actually don't know if this is research based or not, but I don't know if deterioration of certain muscle types or muscle fiber types happen. If anything, I would think that type 2 muscle fibers deteriorate at a faster rate than type 1. Because in older adulthood, we're not usually doing a whole lot of power type movements, but rather it's like standing or postural control and sitting. And usually those are more endurance-based muscle fiber types, which are type 1. So that could be an age-related change, is that if we're not utilizing those type 2 fibers, they're going to atrophy, go away, or they just reduce in size. Right? And then we're not able to utilize those muscle fibers to produce anaerobic power. There are also gender differences, so decline in female performance is usually faster than the decline we see in men, especially during the menopause years. could likely be a result of hormonal changes. And then training is probably our most obvious difference, which I already pointed out in this graph over here.